overwhelming evidence which you have assembled is that these individuals believed that the rules and the guidance were being complied with. And what is so telling is the number of officials who say the same thing and the total silence of the written or electronic record about concerns that anyone wanted to raise with me. It would be one thing if the committee had come here today and said, look, here are the emails or here are the WhatsApps that show that you were warned about rule breaking before you made your statements to the House. You haven't got any such evidence because that never happened. But if you now say instead that it must have been obvious that we were going against the rules and the guidance, then let's be clear about what you are saying. You're not only accusing me of lying, you're accusing all those civil servants, advisors, MPs, of lying about what they believed at the time to be going on. And as far as I know, you're not giving any of them the chance to explain themselves with their own oral evidence. I don't think you seriously mean to accuse those individuals of lying, and I don't think you can seriously mean to accuse me of lying. Now, everyone knows that there are some features of this proceeding that are extremely peculiar. I have the utmost respect for you, the Chair, but you've said some things about this matter before reading the evidence, which are plainly and wrongly prejudicial or prejudge the very issue on which you are adjudicating. I'm going to put your earlier remarks down to the general cut and thrust of politics and trust in what you have stressed at the outset, the impartiality that the committee insists upon and insists upon in your report. The committee is in fact supposed to be inquiring strictly into what I said about rule breaking rather than non-statutory guidance, so much of this interrogation is theoretically irrelevant, but I'm going to take that in my stride because I agree with what you said at the outset. It is your job, in which I want to help you, to understand why I said what I said to Parliament and whether I deliberately set out to deceive. And I emphatically did not. Your first concern is that I may have knowingly or recklessly deceived Parliament on the 1st and 8th December when I said that the rules had not been broken and the guidance had been followed completely in number 10. When I said those words, I was not trying to cover up or conceal anything. I said what I said in good faith, based on what I honestly knew and reasonably believed at the time. That belief, what was in my head, was based on my understanding of the rules and the guidance. That did not mean that I believed that social distancing was complied with perfectly. That is because I and others in the building did not believe it was necessary or possible to have a 2 metre or 1 metre after June the 24th, 2020, electrified force field around every human being. Indeed, that is emphatically not what the guidance prescribes. It specifically says that social distancing should be maintained where possible, having regard to the work environment, and it is clear that in number 10 we had real difficulties in both working efficiently and at speed and in maintaining perfect social distancing. It's a cramped, narrow 18th century townhouse. We had no choice but to meet day in, day out, 7 days a week in an unrelenting battle against COVID. I had to call many meetings on the spot and to call make a great many high-speed decisions. Yes, we certainly did have social distancing. We avoided physical contact. We gave way to each other in the corridors and on the stairs. We gave each other as wide a berth as we could. But it would have been impossible to have a drill sergeant measuring the distance between us all hours of the day and night. So, as the guidance prescribes, we had mitigations. When I spoke about the guidance being followed, I was thinking of all the things we did to stop the spread of COVID, given where we were working. We had large numbers of people working from home. We had many meetings, at least partly on Zoom. We had limits on the numbers per room. We had sanitizer dispensers everywhere. We had signs on the walls telling you which way to walk. We kept windows open and we worked outside as much as possible. Because of the particular difficulties caused by the working environment, we had regular testing, and a whole testing system was set up I believe on the third floor, that went way beyond what was required in the guidance. So if you say, how could I stand up in Parliament and be so categorical about following the guidance? What was I thinking of? That is what I was thinking of. And I know you will, as you've just done, point to the photos and then to the guidance and what I said. And you will say it must have been obvious that the guidance was being breached. But that is simply not true. My beliefs and my remarks to Parliament were indeed based on my knowledge of those events. But you have to understand how I saw them and what I saw during the period I was there. The vast majority of the events relied upon by the committee are events I attended for 10 or 15 minutes, perhaps a maximum of 25 in one case, to say farewell to a departing colleague. I know that people around the country will look at those events and think they look like the very kind of events that we, or I, were forbidding to everyone else. But I will believe till the day I die that it was my job to thank staff for what they had done, especially during a crisis like COVID, which kept coming back, which seemed to have no end, and when people's morale did, I'm afraid, begin to sink. But never mind what I think, the more important point is that the police agreed. They did not find that my attendance at any of these farewell gatherings was against the rules. I obviously did not know at the time that any of these events later escalated beyond what was lawful after I left. There is, of course, one event for which I and the current Prime Minister received fixed penalty notices. But it never occurred to me, or I think the current Prime Minister at the time, that the event was not in compliance with the rules and the guidance. At about 2:22 p.m. on the 19th of June 2020, I went into the cabinet room where I worked after getting back from a long external visit. I stood at my desk briefly before another COVID meeting began and had a kind of salad. A number of officials came in to wish me a happy birthday. No one sang. The famous Union Jack cake remained in its Tupperware box, unnoticed by me, and was later discovered and eaten by my private secretaries. We talked, as you would expect, about COVID and what we were doing to beat the pandemic. It is a measure of how innocent we thought this meeting was that a slightly exaggerated version was briefed to the Times with singing and cake eating, and yet nothing untoward was apparently detected either by the reporter or by millions of eagle-eyed readers. So when I spoke to the Commons, it did not for 1 second on the 1st or the 8th of December, or at any time, it didn't for not 1 second occur to me that this event, the one event for which I was fined, would later be found to be somehow against the rules. And the same goes for all the events I attended. My belief was that we were following the rules and the guidance to the best of our ability, given the circumstances, and that was what the guidance required. You may now say that I was being obtuse or oblivious and that we should have enforced social distancing more ruthlessly. And we can argue that back and forth. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. We're talking about what I believed at the time. As for the event of the 18th of December 2020 in the press room, I was not there, but my honest belief that it was within the rules was based on what I was told by senior advisors. The fact that this was my honest belief is supported by the fact that so many other people honestly believed that we were doing nothing wrong. And it's abundantly clear from the evidence produced by the committee that everyone was operating with the same understanding of the rules and the guidance. If you want further evidence of what was going on in my head, look at the WhatsApp to Jack Doyle, where I positively urge him to get the truth out to the public, the truth out about that December the 18th event. It seemed so unfair to me, based on what I had been told, that the event was being presented as a purely social gathering on what I knew to be a monumentally busy day for the media department, when they were coping both with the emergence that day of the Kent variant of COVID and what some saw as the risk of a no-deal Brexit. That was why I was inclined to believe that this event must be in line with the rules and the guidance. And that's why I said what I said on December the 1st. As for my statements on December the 8th, the committee is concerned that I may have misled the House when I said that I was repeatedly assured that the event was in accordance with the rules. I don't understand this point. You can see from the evidence that I received these assurances more than once and from more than one person. My statement was entirely accurate. The committee criticises the fact that I had not received assurances in relation to the guidance, but I never said that I had. I said what I said about the guidance based on my own experience and belief. The committee is critical of the fact that I did not receive assurances in respect of any event other than the December the 18th event. But I never said that I had. The committee seems at times to be saying in your fourth report that I should not be relying on the advice of political advisers or even officials. This is ridiculous. I was the Prime Minister of the UK. I was trying to run the country during a pandemic. On the evening in question, 30th of November 2021, I was dealing with the emergence of the Omicron variant and the growing clamour for restrictions on another Christmas. I could not drop what I was doing, get up and go and institute a personal investigation into what sounded like a Daily Mirror try-on about an event that was now almost a year old. I had to rely on, and was fully entitled to rely on, what I was told by my senior trusted advisers. Government would be paralysed if ministers were not able to do so. Finally, the committee criticises the manner in which I corrected the record. I corrected the record on the day of Sue Gray's final report and 6 days after the completion of the police investigation. If the committee's view is that I should have come to the House and provided an inevitably incomplete account while a government or a police investigation was going on, including into events I hadn't even attended, I fundamentally disagree. At all times, I was entirely transparent with the House. I made it clear that I did not intend to comment on any of the factual matters until the investigation had been concluded. I kept the House regularly updated, and as soon as the investigations were complete, I provided a full correction of my honest but inadvertently misleading statements. I apologise. I apologise for inadvertently misleading this House, but to say that I did it recklessly or deliberately is completely untrue, as the evidence shows. Whatever we got wrong, I believe that officials in Number 10 and the Cabinet Office, and indeed all Whitehall departments, should be immensely proud of their efforts to protect this country from a loathsome disease. When I point out to this committee that this disease almost killed me, it's only to stress how seriously I took the measures we needed to stop it spreading, as I believe everyone did in Number 10, in Downing Street. It was those officials who organised and took the country through the lockdowns, which, whatever people may say about them now, were essential for public health. It was those officials who procured the vaccines that made sure this was the first country in the world to put an approved and effective vaccine in the arm of a patient. And it was those officials who helped mastermind the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe. It was thanks to those officials that we were able to come out of lockdown faster than any other European country, with all the social and economic benefits that entailed, and still to have a lower excess mortality rate than many other comparable countries. I am proud to have known and worked with those officials during one of the most difficult times we can remember. I am proud to have given them leadership, and that is what I believe I was doing at every one of the events in question. And I trust that the committee will be fair to them, fair to me, fair to the evidence about what we and I knew and believed, and conclude that I did not wittingly mislead the House of Commons or recklessly mislead the House of Commons, and that no contempt has been committed.
Thank you, Mr Johnson. Before I turn to our questions, there's one issue that you raised, which your lawyers wrote to me about on Monday, and which I've replied to you this morning about. You raised the issue of the importance of the committee being fair to officials, and we would very much agree with you about that. And that is why we're not content with putting into evidence interview notes that officials gave to Sue Gray until such time as those officials had a chance to check those interview notes and to agree whether they're accurate, and then they can be supported by a statement of truth, which is like an oath, and then they can be put into evidence to us. If you would like to identify some officials and some aspects of the Sue Gray interview notes that you would like to then get under statements of truth and submit to this inquiry, the inquiry doesn't finish with this oral evidence session. You are perfectly at liberty to do that, and I would invite you to do that, and we can consider it.
Thank you. I will do that. There are I think there are about 16 points that we wish to elucidate, and it would be helpful to do that.
Okay, thank you. And we're putting now in the public domain your lawyer's letter to me and also my reply to you this morning so that people can be clear about that. We'll now begin our questions, starting with those which cover the 6 gatherings that the committee thinks are the most relevant to our inquiry. When asked in the House of Commons about gatherings in number 10 from December 2021 onwards, you told the House that COVID rules and guidance were followed completely and at all times. Following the publication in May 2022 of the report which you'd commissioned into gatherings on government premises, you continued to maintain that it was certainly the case that the rules and guidance were followed at gatherings you had attended to wish farewell to staff who were leaving number 10. We will put to you what the COVID rules and guidance were on those 6 dates, what you knew about the gatherings that took place on each of those dates and their compliance with the rules and guidance then in force. We'll start by looking at 2 leaving gatherings that you attended in November 2020. We'll primarily be focusing on these gatherings' compliance with the COVID workplace guidance in place at the time. These gatherings took place during a national lockdown in England. The legal rules in force to prevent the spread of COVID included restrictions on indoor gatherings of 2 or more people. The workplace guidance in force at that time stated that there should be social distancing of 2 metres in the workplace wherever possible, and that only absolutely necessary participants should physically attend meetings. I will now invite Sir Bernard Jenkin to ask the first question. Sir Bernard.
Thank you, Chair. So as the Chair described, we will first consider what knowledge you had of the rules and guidance in place at the time of each of the events you attended or of which you had knowledge, by reminding ourselves of what you were telling the country about the rules and guidance, and then we will ask about those gatherings. Now, you were aware of the importance of following the guidance the government had issued to keep workplaces safe. Indeed, you previously told the House of Commons on the 2nd of September 2020, and I quote, "It's very important that we get people back into the workplace in a COVID-secure way," unquote. And then on the 9th of November 2020, less than a week before the first of the gatherings that I will ask you about, you said at a COVID press conference, and I quote, "Neither mass testing nor progress on vaccines are at the present time a substitute for the national restrictions, for social distancing and all the rest. So it is all the more important to follow the rules," unquote. And at the press conferences over this period, you regularly repeated the phrase, hands, face, space, while standing at podiums bearing this phrase. So there can be no doubt that you understood what the guidance and rules meant and were intended to achieve. Yes or no?
Yes.
Thank you. On the 13th of November 2020, which we saw Catherine West just asking about on the film earlier, there was an impromptu leaving gathering for your then Director of Communications, Lee Kane. This was held in the vestibule outside the press office in number 10. Between 15 and 20 people were present and you gave a speech. And the evidence for this is at page 9 of the evidence bundle. Do you accept that these facts are correct?
Yes.
We will now show the pictures, which you have made your comments about, but nevertheless we will ask you about them. The unpixelated photos are on page 540 and 580 in the bundle of the total evidence pack. The pictures show you with at least 6 to 8 other people standing in close proximity. I want to ask first about this gathering's compliance with the guidance. You told the House of Commons as recently as the 25th of May 2022, which was the day of the publication of the Sucre report, that it was, and I quote, certainly the case, strong words, that guidance had been followed at gatherings you attended to wish staff farewell, at least while you were there. At least while you were there. But the photographs show a lack of social distancing of 2 metres, which was required by the workplace guidance at the time.
It was 1 metre we were together.
So do you accept that you were present at this gathering and that people were not socially distanced while you were there?
Thank you very much, Sir Bernard. I don't accept that people were not making an effort to distance themselves socially from each other, and that happened the whole time in number 10. Actually, I think that the guidance by November 2020 stipulated that you should maintain 1 metre social distancing where possible, with mitigation where 2 metres is not viable. And at all stages, the guidance was intended to be implemented where possible, and that is absolutely clear from the guidance. As I said in my introduction, it was always the case that we understood that the confines of number 10 were going to make it impossible the whole time to enforce total social distancing, as it were, with an electric force field around every individual. Now, this meeting happened on an impromptu basis. It had to happen. It happened because on November the 13th, 2 senior members of the... And people will ask, why was this happening? Why was it necessary? It was necessary because 2 senior members of staff, the effective Chief of Staff and the Director of Communications, had both left the building or were about to leave the building in pretty acrimonious circumstances, or what were potentially acrimonious circumstances. It was important for me to be there and to give reassurance. And the salient point I would venture to make is that following that gathering, no fine was issued to me. My presence there was felt by the Met to be not to be unlawful. They agreed that it was a work-related event, and I believe it was absolutely essential for work purposes.
Right, well, I'm asking about the guidance at the moment.
Yes, and I'm telling you that I believe the guidance so what you've got to understand, when I looked at that group, it did not for 1 second occur to me that we were in breach of the guidance, given the logistical difficulties we faced in number 10 and the need to have urgent meetings such as this.
You said, you didn't quite answer my question to begin with, because you suggested that the picture doesn't show that people weren't making an effort to comply with the guidance. I'm just asking whether the evidence is that the guidance was being complied with, and I think by suggesting
I believe that the guidance is being complied with.
Right. Okay. Because I'll come to that. Because it must have occurred to you that, given that they weren't social distancing at 2 metres, that they might have been in breach of the social distancing guidance, either while you were at the gathering or indeed, as you reflected on this afterwards, as the storm broke around your head, you must have been thinking, well, I wonder whether that was really complying with the guidance. That must have occurred.
So, Bernard, forgive me, but I've got to correct you on a point of a technical point. After June 24th, 2020, the guidance was changed so that the objective was to maintain social distancing at 1 metre with mitigations where 2 metres were not viable.
I'll come to that. But I think the first point is that it's fair to say that you didn't say that we did every effort to comply with the guidance of the House of Commons, and you didn't say that... No,
I'm saying that we followed the guidance completely. No. Because you can't...
okay, right.
We'll come to this in a minute.
Okay.
But you can't expect human beings in an environment like number 10 to have, as it were, a invisible electrified fence around them. They will occasionally drift into each other's orbit. When I saw that, it did not mean to me that we had breached the guidance. It meant that we were following the guidance to the best of our ability, which was what the guidance provided for. And the guidance provides for freedoms within the practical framework of the operation or the business to decide how you're going to implement the guidance. The measures that you referred to at the outset are things that need usually to be complied with. Businesses are entitled and asked to decide what practical considerations they wish to give to implementing the guidance, and that is what we did. Can I just say, so people understand why I believed, because this is the crucial thing, if I may say so, why I believed when I stood up on December the 1st that the guidance was followed completely at all times in number 10. What picture I had in my head, and why that doesn't conflict with that picture. The answer is that I knew from my direct personal experience that we were doing a huge amount to stop the spread of COVID within the building. We had sanitizers, we had windows were kept open, we had people working outdoors wherever they could, we had Zoom meetings, we had restrictions on the number of people in rooms, we had perspex screens between desks, and above all, as I said, we had testing, regular testing, which went way beyond what the guidance prescribed, and which in my view helped mitigate the difficulties we had in maintaining perfect social distancing.
Right, I'm bound to say that if you'd said all that at the time to the House of Commons, we probably wouldn't be sitting here. But you didn't. And the question is about what the guidance actually says. And I noticed you taking a little advice at that point on the question of the guidance. Can I just read to you, it's on page 6 of the bundle, what the guidance actually says. You must maintain social distancing in the workplace wherever possible. Where the social distancing guidelines cannot be followed in full in relation to a particular activity, the businesses should consider whether that activity be redesigned to maintain a 2-metre social distance, or 1 metre with risk mitigations where 2 metres is not viable. And the mitigating actions include using screens or barriers to separate people from each other. So where in the picture are there screens or barriers?
There were screens or barriers in the, I believe, in the adjacent press room from memory. Well, this is an impromptu gathering at which I'm thanking staff, at least one member of staff, for his contribution during COVID. I believe it was an important part of my job to do that. That was the best place to do it. I accept that perfect social distancing, Sir Bernard, is not being observed, but that does not mean that what we were doing, in my view, is incompatible with the guidance. The guidance specifically allows for workplace freedoms to decide how to implement it, and the operative conditional is where possible. Now, do not for one moment believe that people in number 10 did not operate social distancing, because they did, and they took great effort. They made great efforts, in my view, to my memory, to stay apart from each other. But that didn't mean that they were able to stay apart from each other the whole time. That's what I'm saying. Well, that did not conflict with the guidance.
Nobody is devaluing the efforts of anybody in number 10 during the COVID, including you, by the way, and the public service you gave during your period as Prime Minister during the pandemic. All we're asking is to, I'm afraid, it's our obligation.
I'm trying to explain to you why I said that the guidance was followed.
I'm halfway through a question. All I'm saying is that we've got to find out, establish in our minds, whether what you told the House of Commons was strictly accurate. And the guidance goes on to say, where social distancing guidelines cannot be followed in full, even through redesigning a particular activity, businesses should consider whether that activity needs to continue for the business to operate. And if so, take all the mitigating actions possible to reduce the risk of transmission between the staff. Now, nobody is disputing that it's the right thing for you to thank your staff. The question is whether what you said about this particular way of thanking your staff in the House of Commons was strictly accurate. indeed may have been misleading. That's what we're asking.
Well, I don't believe for a second that it was.
The guidance does not say you can have a thank you party and as many people in the room as you like. If you think it's very important to thank people, the guidance doesn't say that.
Let's just go back over that. I believed that this event was not only reasonably necessary, but it was essential for work purposes for the reasons that I have given. I've described the constraints in which we were operating in number 10. If you wanted to have a rapid gathering to thank people, this was the place to do it. There aren't, in fact, that many people there. I accept, though the pixelation makes it difficult to work out exactly who is where. I accept that perfect social distancing is not
got the unpixelated.
Sure, but the public can't see that.
Yeah.
The public can't see that.
Yes, but that's
Bernard,
not.
I accept that not everybody is perfectly socially distanced in that picture, but that did not mean to me, when I stood up in the House of Commons and said that the guidance was followed completely, I was not thinking of that event and thinking that somehow that contravened the guidance. Absolutely not.
Okay.
We were making a huge effort to follow the guidance. That was my memory, and that is why I said what I said.
This is exactly the purpose of this session, that you can make the case that you're making. Can we move on to examine the compliance with the COVID rules at this gathering? As we heard in the clips earlier, you told the House the rules were followed at all times, so you must have thought the gathering was reasonably necessary for work purposes, as was then required by the regulations. We know that the gathering attracted fixed penalty notices. So in fact, the police have judged that it broke the rules. Why did you think it was within the rules?
I thought it was essential for work purposes, or at least reasonably necessary for work purposes, because for the reason I've given, Sir Bernard, that November the 13th was a day in which two senior officials, senior advisors in government, had left their jobs in very, very difficult and challenging circumstances. And it was necessary to steady the ship. It was necessary to show that there was no rancour, that the business of the government was being carried on. That's what we had to do. That's what I had to do.
I know that, but it's what you said about it to the House of Commons is what matters. We know it was a leaving event for a member of staff. The photographs we've just seen do not seem to show any actual work being done. Why did it not occur to you that it at least might have been in breach of the regulations, not least because it was not reasonably necessary for work purposes?
Did you say, did it occur to me that it might not be reasonably necessary for work purposes?
Yes.
No, it didn't occur to me for 1 second that it wasn't reasonably necessary for work purposes.
To do it in that particular way and then say that particular thing about the way that event was actually carried on?
I really, to this day, and as I said earlier on, I struggle to see how I could have run number 10, run hundreds of officials who needed to be thanked and appreciated for their work in very trying circumstances without having brief farewell events of a kind that, at least insofar as my participation was concerned, did not fall foul of the rules. I just remind you of that key point about that event. I was not. I was there for a maximum of 20 minutes or 25 minutes, I think. I gave a short speech.
Could I cut in at
what
this
I did
point?
was not found to have been in breach of the rules.
Could I cut in at this point? Because how long you were at the gathering is not a question
I understand
that Sir Bernard is asking you. And while I'm interjecting, you raised the question of imperfect social distancing. Social distancing, hands, face, space, which is the spaced part, is either 2 metres at this time, or it's 1 metre with mitigations.
2 metres where possible.
2 metres.
2 metres where possible.
2 metres or 1 metre with mitigations, which is screens.
It doesn't say 1 metre where possible.
It
doesn't say that.
The objective of social distancing is to maintain social distancing wherever possible. That's what it says.
So what is the notion of a less than perfect, an imperfect social distancing? Because you were telling the country to do social distancing.
Yes, but so did we in number 10. And but I'm sure, by the way, that up and down the country, in spite of people's observance of social distancing, there were times when people drifted within 1 or 2 metres of each other. That is, I'm afraid, just inevitable. And we had a particular problem in number 10 because, as I said earlier on, we had to call meetings at great speed. We had large numbers of staff that had to come into the building because we needed to get a variety of opinions, even though we had loads and loads of people also on Zoom. And it was not, we had as you know, because you've been to look at it, we had lots of higgledy-piggledy corridors where it wasn't, and spaces where it wasn't always easy to maintain perfect social distancing. That did not mean to, like that space there, that did not mean to me that
about higgledy-piggledy corridors. If you could just refer yourself to Sir Bernard's next question, which is about an event.
There were lots of people leading critical organisations around the country, and a leaving do for everyone else around the country was not acceptable under the guidelines, all the rules. So why was it acceptable and necessary for work purposes in number 10?
Thank you, Sir Bernard. Well, I want to repeat what I said at the beginning. I understand that people looking at that photograph will think that it looks like a social event. It was not a social event. If anybody thinks that I was partying during lockdown, they're completely wrong. That was not a party. I was there to...
I haven't said it was a party, Mr. Johnson.
Well, you did actually earlier on. What I was doing was thanking staff, or thanking one individual in particular, for their contribution. And I believe that was my job.
So if you'd been asked at a press conference with your podium saying hands, face, space, whether it was okay for organisations to hold unsocially distanced farewell gatherings in the workplace, what would you have said?
I would have said that it's up to organisations, as the guidance says, to decide how and they are going to implement the guidance, amongst which is, of course, social distancing. Where they can't do social distancing perfectly, they can't maintain 2 metres or 1 metre, then they're entitled to have mitigations. And that's what the guidance says. And we did indeed have plenty of mitigations, including, and as I've said to you before, this was exceptional in number 10, we had a great deal of testing.
So the answer is you would have said it was okay?
No, I said the answer is that you should do what the guidance says. And the guidance says that where you put in mitigations, where you do what is possible, then and where you follow social distancing in a way that is that reflects the realities of your workspace, that will be in compliance with the guidance. That was my view, and I think that's what everybody else understood. Certainly, that and just can I repeat this point? This is what everybody understood, I believe, in number 10. It's for a long period of 20 months of the struggle against COVID, during which we were having, as the Prime Minister himself has said, describing the experience of walking into loads of rooms and finding lots of people there. It was simply part of working in number 10 that we were going to come into contact with a great number of people. But people did follow social distancing, and they were acutely conscious of it.
I now turn to the 27th of November 2020. This was another unplanned leaving gathering for a different special advisor that again took place in the vestibule outside the press office in number 10. And we have 3 witness statements attesting to a lack of social distancing at this event. We've got, and this is on page 17 of your witness bundle, we've got Jack Doyle, who was your press secretary at the time and subsequently your director of communications, saying that there were certainly more than 20 people in attendance. And do you accept that?
I don't know. I wasn't at that event, and it wasn't an event that was found to have been in breach of the rules.
There's no reason to dispute it.
Well, I happen to know because we've all seen the same evidence bundle. Though I think this is one of the things that you have that we haven't been allowed to point to. I think there is evidence from at least one of the participants that there weren't that many people there, and it lasted a very short time.
Well, by all means, make sure that's drawn to our attention.
Oh, sorry. This is the Clio event.
Sorry, you mustn't mention any names.
I think that name we can mention. That event, my memory of that event. Forgive me, I was at that event, but I was there very briefly.
I was going to correct you.
Thank you. So I was at that event, but I was there very briefly. No fines were issued for that event.
Order. I'm afraid we have to suspend the committee again. There's a division in the Commons. We'll return in 15 minutes.
Okay, another division bell rings.